Mr. Goble, first of all, I would like to get your thoughts on the ongoing the cross-border incursion. How would you characterize it?
Well, the most remarkable thing about it is not just that the Ukrainians have been able to cross the border and penetrate ever deeper into Russia, but that there has not been the kind of upswelling of Russian patriotism that we would have seen, would we expect to see in most countries. I don't know any other country on earth where a foreign army could cross into that country, occupy a significant portion of it, and where there would not be demands for mobilization, for dispatch of all the forces that the state has as its resources as in hand. The fact that that has not happened reveals something very, very disturbing about the nature of Russian society under Vladimir Putin. I expected that one of the great risks the Ukrainians were taking, that by crossing the border they would have led to the mobilization of Russians who would have been willing to see a new wider draft of Russians to go and fight not only to drive the Ukrainians out of Kursk Oblast, but also to go into Ukraine itself. That's not happened. And that suggests that Mr. Putin is much less in control of the situation as far as the population is concerned. The other thing that's been very surprising is that the Kremlin simply doesn't know how to react. That the meeting that Mr. Putin had with senior officials, not only in Moscow, from Moscow, but from the regions, was appalling. It was out of control. People were saying things. The governor of course, said, "I have no idea where the line of the front is." People had none of the kind of confidence that you would have expected. And Mr. Putin sat there. And when he did speak, and it was clear, as several people have pointed out, that he spoke from notes that he'd written himself, not had been prepared by his staff, he said things that suggested he was out of touch. I don't think I'm the only one who noticed that. I think that large numbers of Russians noticed that. So this has been a major defeat for Mr. Putin, not in the conventional military sense so much that the Russian military has shown itself incapable of defending even its own territory, but what it's revealed about the nature of the Russian political elite and what it's revealed about the Russian population. That's far more important in terms of what's going to happen next. I have very grave doubts that unless there is a radical change of course in Moscow, that the Ukrainians will not be able to proceed even deeper into Russia in the coming days, and that then we'll be in a situation where people will be talking about, well, let's agree, you withdraw from Russia, we'll withdraw from Ukraine. I don't think anyone could have expected that just 2 weeks ago, but that's where we're headed, and the demands for that may very well come from people within Putin's own team who can see that if things continue the way they're going, the population, which is sullen, which is not in support of even defending their own country, is that no one controls it. And then all kinds of things are possible, including a revolutionary situation, which could lead to Mr. Putin's overthrow and his arrest or his complete ouster from Russia to The Hague. I All of those things were impossible 2 weeks ago. They're not impossible now. And that, I think, more than the details of what's going on in the ground, is the important. There was a Russian joke a year ago when Prigozhin launched his mutiny, if we can call it that. It was said, a Russian said that before Putin invaded Ukraine, Russians could say that they had the second most powerful army in the world. After Russia invaded Ukraine, Russians could say that Russia had the second most powerful army in Ukraine. Now, with the Prigozhin rising, uh, they could only say that the Russian army was the second most powerful army inside the Russian Federation. I have a feeling that people will be remembering that joke now, but it will be far more told with far more bitterness and far more anger at the Kremlin, which has led Russia into a disaster. This is an amazing thing. I think we're going to be focusing on what this tells us about Russian society and the Russian political elite long after the negotiations happen, long after we track every village seized or not seized by Ukrainian forces. This is a turning point in Russian history, and it's one that uh, President Zelensky of Ukraine has provoked by a brilliant action that has turned the tables over, if you will. And so I'm expecting this to have huge consequences inside Russia. The possibilities, unfortunately, are so broad that saying exactly what they'll look like isn't really possible now.
You said that there wasn't much rise of enthusiasm and patriotism, but for that to happen, the leaders should at least admit that there is an occupation, that we've been attacked. But instead, Putin says that it's just a provocation and it's only anti-terrorism operation.
Well,
So what?
here's my point. I don't care what the leaders say. There's enough reporting going into Russia that Ukrainian forces are on the territory of the Russian Federation, that there is a foreign army that has crossed the Russian state border, which was supposed to be inviolable, according to Mr. Putin, and everybody knows that. The failure of the government to address that puts it at odds with the people if the people behave the way you would expect a normal nation to behave. They're not. Now, why is that? Well, I think there are several reasons. The first is Mr. Putin has degraded or corrupted the meaning of war by failing to call his own invasion of Ukraine a war. He's reduced it all to this is just movement of people around. Well, that may be okay for describing his use of forces, but it is definitely not the way an average Russian is going to think about the invasion of his country. Again and again, we've seen news reports in the last week where people said, "I never thought they could cross the Russian border." That's a different position that's not dependent on what Mr. Putin's propagandists say or don't say. Uh, I have much more confidence and much more respect for the Russian people than Mr. Putin does. I don't believe that the Russian people need to be led by someone to be patriotic. The fact that they've chosen not to be, in the absence of being led, speaks volumes about a very sick society. And Mr. Putin bears enormous responsibility for just how sick Russian society has become.
How would you comment on the Western reaction, and in particular the U.S. reaction, and
Well,
how
first off,
what do you think the timing? Do you think the timing mattered, given the
well,
U.S. upcoming
I
elections?
think the reaction of Western countries, which has been respectful but subdued, is exactly what you'd expect, given that Mr. Putin's propagandists are insisting that this was all somehow a plan hatched in Washington or Brussels. And so saying too many things about this would simply give grist to Mr. Putin's mill that this is a Western plot, a Western provocation. This was a Ukrainian decision. I have no doubt that people in the West knew about it in advance, but they didn't decide on this. This was decided upon in Kiev by Ukrainians, and the Ukrainian army is carrying it out quite brilliantly. Mr. Putin's failure to pull troops wherever he has to in order to counter that is the big story here.
You think that the West knew? Now,
Oh, I'm sorry. I can't imagine,
uh-huh.
given the amount of Western Western presence in Kiev, that there weren't indications. Uh, people, the Russians knew, the SRV knew, the FSB knew, the military was told. I can't say whether Putin was told, because I have a feeling that when officials in his government are ushered into the presence, they tend to tell him what he wants to hear. But it's not like this was done in such great secrecy that no one knew. So, if in fact there was enough evidence for the FSB and SVR to know what was going on, and there were people, Russians have been reporting this, that people were aware that forces had been moved up to the border, so on and so forth. I find it inconceivable that the Western officials, diplomats, whatever, in in Kiev didn't know. But to know about something is hardly the same thing as organizing it. I think that saying to suggest that because the West knew in advance, it organized it is absurd. It's a stretch that's just not true.
Now, the U.S. Elections, we in the August 19th, the Democratic Convention is coming up. Former President Trump had an interview or a chat, call it how you want, with Elon Musk, where he said that again, praised Putin, saying that he knows what he's doing. He loves his country. Um, what does timing tell you? Do you think it was timed so before any sort of uh, change in White House? Do you think that mattered at all?
I think that the Ukrainian government, given the uncertainty of what will happen in the United States, wanted to get a victory, wanted to change the course of the future of negotiations and the possibility of uh, forcing a partial or even complete Russian withdrawal from the areas that Moscow has occupied. I think they wanted to do that before the elections. Now, that's not before a convention. I don't think you can say this happened this week because next week there's something happening in the American political calendar. I also think that the Ukrainian government is aware that the prospects for a return to power of Donald Trump are a whole lot less than they were a month ago. That Vice President Harris is doing very much better in the polls, both in states she was expected to win and in places where she wasn't expected to win. That the Trump campaign is, in fact, imploding, and that unless something really strange happens, that's again a black swan that we can't predict, I find it very, very unlikely that Vice President Harris won't be the first Madam President of the United States next January. That doesn't mean that Trump is going to give up, but I think the basic reading of most analysts, not only in the United States but in the West and in Ukraine, is that we're going to see a continuation of Western support for Ukraine. That you're not going to see NATO fragment, as I fear would have been the case had Mr. Trump been returned to office. I think Mr. Putin, or excuse me, Mr. Trump's statements about Mr. Putin now hurt him more than they did. When it looked like Ukraine was losing, suggesting that the Americans should get on the side of, quote, the winner, made a whole lot more sense in terms of domestic American politics. Now that it looks like maybe Russia isn't winning, maybe Ukraine has gotten the upper hand, then I think the idea that you'd want to get yourself in an alliance with someone who's, quote, losing, doesn't win as many votes. So I'm sure that this had something to do with the political calendar in the United States, but I don't think it's as precise as that because next week there's going to be a national convention of the Democratic Party. I think this was driven. I think it was driven by two things besides this strategically thinking that we could change the course of the war. On the one hand, Russia had been making a lot of progress in a lot of places along the front, and I think this was a throw of the dice to try to force Russia to pull troops out of some or indeed all of that front line to try to defend against the Ukrainian army going into Russia. So that would lessen the pressure on the Ukrainian front. The second time, I think there seems to be a growing awareness that Moscow is in trouble as far as raising enough troops. Not only has it suffered perhaps almost 1 million casualties, I don't not deaths, but deaths and wounded, but it is finding it more and more difficult to fill the ranks of its army by buying people, by paying large amounts of money. In the last few days alone, there have been dozens of articles saying the whole strategy based on getting enough people to sign up by offering money isn't working. We're at the end. So either you have to mobilize somehow, or you have to think about how to end this war so that you don't have to. That there just simply aren't the resources in the Russian system other than a state mobilization. And Putin has been very reluctant to order a mobilization because that would be extremely unpopular. It would be something that I think might change the outcome of a number of gubernatorial elections next month. I think it could lead to mass demonstrations. People don't want mass mobilization. They would have accepted it if mass mobilization were tied to the idea of expelling Ukrainian troops from Russian territory. The idea that they will accept mass mobilization to engage in Vladimir Putin's effort to grab this or that part of Ukraine, I think is no longer valid. And so, what's happening in Kursk is a turning point in Russian history, not just of this war, but of and of Mr. Putin's fate. He made a terrible error in going into Ukraine to begin with. He has compounded that error by the way he has managed the conflict, and he's compounded it yet again by not taking a much more patriotic centered approach to Kursk. It's possible that if he did that, he could take a lot of Russians with him. Not everyone, but a lot. That he hasn't done that means that the number of people he's going to take with him, whatever he does, is going to be smaller. And if I can see that, there are lots of people in Moscow who can see it as well. And that's how a political leader begins to lose his luster and maybe more than that.
Mr. Paul Goble, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.